When they gave me 20 years, I didn't argue. I lowered my eyes and signed the papers without even reading them. I thought that's how it had to be. If the world had turned its back on me, then I must be guilty. In prison, I killed time until one day I opened a law book and found myself inside it. I read my own case. I saw everything that had been overlooked. I enrolled in a legal education program. They didn't believe in me. They tried to stop me. But I didn't give up because my first client was me. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Valerie Carter. I was 33 years old when the judge read out the sentence that would fold my life into a prison cell. 20 years. The words fell like concrete. They didn't echo. They didn't move. They just landed, heavy and final, sealing everything I had been into a future that no longer belonged to me. I stood there in my second-hand suit, gray, wrinkled at the elbows, and tried not to look small. My knees wanted to bend. My eyes wanted to close. But I had promised myself that I would not fall apart in front of them. The courtroom was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Even the bailiff had stopped shifting. My public defender didn't touch my arm, didn't whisper a final word. He just gathered his papers, like the hearing was a meeting that had run over time, and there was somewhere else to be. The judge's voice was tired. She didn't look at me, not really. Her gaze floated just above my head, as if eye contact would somehow complicate things. Conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, she read, wire fraud, submitting false claims, participation in a criminal enterprise. I had heard those words so many times during the trial that they no longer stung. They had become vocabulary, not truth. But the number that followed, 20 years, was a sharp edge I hadn't prepared for. 20. I hadn't killed anyone. I hadn't stolen a car or hurt a child. I hadn't even understood fully what I was signing when the papers came across my desk. I had been a billing coordinator at a private healthcare clinic in Miami, a place with glossy floors and soft music in the lobby. I processed paperwork, handled claims, followed instructions. When a new doctor joined the practice, and suddenly everything began to move faster, more patients, more referrals, more approvals, I asked questions. I was told to trust the process. So I did. I didn't understand then that the process was a machine built on lies. By the time the federal investigation opened, it was too late. My name was on too many documents. My signature was on too many forms. The men who ran the clinic had long since vanished into quiet neighborhoods and foreign bank accounts. I was left holding the bag. I tried to explain. I tried to say I didn't know. But ignorance is not a defense, not in courtrooms where the scales tip with subtle cruelty. The prosecutor called me cooperative but complicit. She said I was educated enough to know better, that I had failed to stop the fraud, and therefore I had helped it thrive. The jury didn't look angry, just bored, like the whole thing had been decided weeks ago, and this was the paperwork. My mother didn't come to the trial. She hadn't returned my calls in months. My son, James, was 15. He hadn't written since the day I was arrested. I imagined him in school, trying not to tell anyone that his mother was away. I had no one in the courtroom, not a single friend, not a single hand to hold. When the verdict was read, I felt more ashamed of that than of the crime itself. The courtroom emptied around me, the soft shuffle of feet and briefcases moving past my shoulders. I stayed still, waiting for the moment they would take me away. A correctional officer with a square jaw and kind eyes stood beside me. He didn't rush. He waited for me to take a breath. When I finally turned toward the exit, I heard the click of the cuffs before I felt them. The metal was cold, impersonal, and strangely comforting. At least now, there was no more pretending. The ride to the processing center was silent. I sat in the back of the van, hands folded in my lap, watching the city blur through the tinted windows. Palm trees waved like they were mocking me. Sunshine poured over streets I would not walk again for a very long time. The buildings looked too clean, too far away. I imagined James at home, maybe watching TV, maybe not thinking of me at all. At intake, I surrendered everything I had left: my clothes, my purse, my necklace, a gift from my grandmother, tarnished at the clasp. I stood under flickering lights while a woman in blue scrubs listed off regulations like grocery items. No earrings, no wires in bras, no outside books unless approved. I signed forms with shaking hands. Then they gave me a uniform, orange and stiff, and a pair of canvas shoes that pinched my toes. My hair was tied back. My ID was printed and clipped to my chest like a name tag at a job I hadn't applied for. I was led to my unit in silence. The doors opened and closed with a mechanical rhythm that I would soon learn to anticipate. My new world smelled like bleach and steam and old plastic. I was assigned a bunk on the lower level. The mattress was thin, and the sheet barely covered it. My cellmate didn't look up. She was older, her hair more gray than black, reading a book with no cover. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands again, unsure of what to do with them. My heart was beating too fast. My thoughts wouldn't stay still. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. There's a kind of grief that arrives not with sobbing, but with silence. It sits in your throat and presses down, making every breath a little harder. That first night, I didn't sleep. I lay on my side, facing the wall, listening to the sounds of a building that never truly rested. Doors slamming, footsteps echoing, distant murmurs, the buzz of fluorescent lights. I stared at the cinder block and tried to count the little specks in the paint. I had been sentenced. I had been processed. I had been erased from my own life. But under all of that, beneath the weight of shame and fear and loneliness, something small remained. A flicker, a breath, a question. What if I didn't let this be the end? What if the walls weren't the end of my story, but the beginning of another? I didn't have the answer then. I didn't have anything, but I had time. And somewhere, deep in the marrow of that time, I would find a way back. It started with a pamphlet, one of those forgotten stacks tucked into the metal rack outside the prison chapel. Someone had left it crooked, its corner bent, like it had been handled without care. I wasn't looking for anything that day. I had come to the chapel just to sit, just to breathe in air that didn't smell like disinfectant or boiled meat. But the title caught me: Correspondence Courses in Law. Learn Your Rights. Understand the System. I picked it up with the same detached curiosity I used to feel when skimming magazines in a doctor's office. But this time, I didn't put it back. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the ink slightly smeared in places. It listed options: introductory legal studies, criminal procedure, constitutional law, legal writing. I didn't understand most of the terms. Habeas corpus sounded like a disease. Due process felt like a phrase I had heard shouted on the news, not something I had any claim to. But there was something about the list, about the idea of learning not just what had been done to me, but how it had been done, that lodged in my mind and refused to leave. I filled out the form in pencil, pressing too hard on the paper. I mailed it using a stamped envelope I bought with the last of my commissary credit, knowing it meant I'd be skipping snacks for the rest of the week. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to hear laughter or warnings or stories of how these things never went anywhere. I just waited. Weeks passed. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky outside the rec yard was the color of old tin, a mail cart rolled into our unit. An officer called my name. My hands shook as I signed the clipboard. It was a manila envelope, thick, heavier than anything I'd held since arriving. Inside, course materials, a welcome letter, a syllabus, and a used textbook whose margins were already filled with someone else's confusion. I sat on my bunk and turned the pages slowly. The text was dense, full of citations and terminology that left me breathless, but I read anyway. I read until my eyes blurred. I underlined passages I didn't yet understand. I copied definitions into a spiral notebook I had begged off another woman who had too. I read case names aloud under my breath like spells, like mantras. Gideon v. Wainwright, Miranda v. Arizona, Strickland v. Washington. Something in me woke up. During work shifts in the laundry room, I repeated legal principles in my head like prayers. I learned the difference between criminal and civil court. I memorized the structure of the appellate process. I started writing flashcards on scraps of cardboard cut from cereal boxes. I folded them into my pockets and read them on the yard, mouthing the words silently like a secret language. It wasn't easy. Nothing inside those walls was. The guards mocked my books sometimes. "Studying for your next crime?" one of them joked when he saw me with a binder full of notes. I didn't answer. There was no point. They couldn't understand that for the first time in my life, I was beginning to see the framework behind the curtain, the gears behind the sentence. The more I learned, the more I questioned, not just the fairness of my own trial, but the system as a whole. Why had my public defender failed to file a motion that could have suppressed the prosecution's main evidence? Why had I been charged with conspiracy when the actual orchestrators walked away with plea deals? Why had I never been told that ineffective assistance of counsel was an argument with legal weight? I requested my trial transcripts. It took months, and I had to write multiple grievance letters to get them. When they arrived, I read them like a sacred text, line by line, word by word. I highlighted every misstep, every omission. I read my own name spoken aloud by strangers, dissecting each phrase like an autopsy of my life. By then, other women had started to notice. One of them, a quiet woman named Kendra, who had been inside since she was 19, asked me if I could help her write a letter to the parole board. She had tried before, but her petitions had always been denied. I helped her organize her thoughts, cite supporting cases, and explain the rehabilitation programs she had completed. She mailed the letter with trembling hands. When she got her hearing, she cried into my shoulder like a child. Others followed. I became the unofficial jailhouse lawyer, not because I had a degree, but because I cared, because I listened, because I took their stories and wove them into something that sounded like dignity. I didn't promise miracles. I couldn't. But I gave them language. I gave them structure. And in return, I began to believe that maybe I had value beyond my worst mistake. At night, I studied legal writing. I practiced drafting motions and formatting affidavits. I mimicked real briefs using templates I copied by hand from a paralegal manual someone donated to the library. My fingers cramped. My back ached. But I didn't stop. The law had once been a weapon used against me. Now I was learning how to hold it in my own hands. There was something terrifying and beautiful about understanding how the system worked, not just its cruelty, but its cracks, the overlooked technicalities, the forgotten precedents, the spaces where one woman, sitting in a cold room with a pencil and a borrowed textbook, could make a dent. I started a journal. I called it Letters of the Law. I filled it with everything I learned, not just legal definitions, but reflections, questions, a record of each woman I tried to help. What we wrote, what was denied, what was accepted, what we tried again. It became my compass, my anchor. It reminded me, page after page, that knowledge was survival, that words could open doors just as easily as they closed them. I wasn't a lawyer, not yet, but I was becoming something, and I knew one day I would be ready to use everything I had learned on the hardest case of all, my own. By the third year of my sentence, the prison yard had become a kind of classroom, not in the literal sense. There were no blackboards or chalk, no lectures given under open skies, but in the way that it carved lessons into you through repetition, silence, and the hard curve of steel benches warmed by sun. It was there, seated with my back to the chain-link fence and a borrowed textbook in my lap, that I truly began to understand what it meant to study the law, not as theory, but as a lifeline. I used to think education happened in neat rows, in buildings with bells and grades, and teachers who smiled when you raised your hand. But in here, learning was messier. It came in fragments, in pages torn from dictionaries, in overheard conversations between lifers, in questions whispered across laundry baskets or scrawled on the back of food packaging. My study materials were pieced together from discarded handouts, worn photocopies, and a library cart that visited once a week like a miracle in squeaky wheels. My desk was a concrete slab. My pen was often borrowed. My time was stolen from between mandatory shifts and surprise lockdowns. But I was hungry, starved even, not for freedom. I'd stopped daydreaming about that, but for comprehension, for the ability to name the thing that had swallowed my life. I wanted to speak its language, not just mimic it, but understand it deeply, structurally, sentence by sentence. Every morning, before the noise of the day began, I sat on that bench with a spiral notebook and a goal. One concept, just one: due process, double jeopardy, prosecutorial discretion, collateral estoppel. I would write the term in capital letters, underline it 3 times, then break it down the way my son once broke down his vocabulary homework when he was in third grade: root words, context, application. I imagined I was teaching myself the same way I would have taught him, had life unfolded differently. I developed rituals. I copied entire paragraphs from the textbooks into longhand just to feel the shape of the sentences. I read court decisions aloud to myself under my breath, rolling the cadence of legal writing around on my tongue. I diagrammed the appeals process on brown paper bags from the commissary. My notes looked like maps drawn by a woman trying to escape a maze, which, in many ways, I was. The other women started calling me Professor. At first, it was a joke, a nickname passed around the unit like an inside reference, but then it stuck. Even the guards used it sometimes. "Professor, you got mail," one of them said one afternoon, tossing a manila envelope through the slot in the door. Inside was a new set of study modules: case law, constitutional review, statutory interpretation. I held the materials in both hands like they might vanish. I wasn't just studying for me anymore. Word had gotten around. Women started sliding notes under my cell door, questions about their charges, about time credits, about parole eligibility. Some didn't want help, only someone to listen to the nonsense their court-appointed attorneys had told them. Others brought me paperwork, crumpled and stained, asking what this meant or what that deadline was. I answered every question I could. When I didn't know, I found out. Each case became a lesson. I learned more from their files than from my textbooks. I learned how overworked attorneys miss filing deadlines. I learned how plea deals are crafted with pressure and fear instead of fairness. I learned how entire lives are lost in footnotes. I began drafting grievances, re-entry plans, even basic motions. I used carbon paper, wrote by hand, pressed hard so the second copy was legible. We mailed them off together, our hope folded inside like contraband. But it wasn't just the work. It was the power that came with naming things. I watched women sit a little straighter after understanding what had happened to them, after learning that the system wasn't omniscient, just efficient. There was something transformative about knowing that your fate wasn't written in stone, but in a language that could be learned. I made flashcards and shared them with the women who couldn't read well. I read statutes aloud and let them repeat the phrases until they were memorized. I turned the day room into a quiet space of question and answer. I wrote everything down in a thick ledger I called the bench journal. It had names, dates, deadlines, and a single line for every woman I had tried to help. Some got hearings, some didn't. Some just needed to be reminded they still mattered. There were setbacks. Some of my motions were denied without comment. Some letters were returned unopened. There were nights I cried into my pillow, feeling foolish for ever believing that paper and ink could bend a system built to forget us. But by morning, I returned to the bench. The habit had become a kind of prayer, a ritual of faith in the slow machinery of understanding. One winter, a woman named Carla received a parole hearing because of a brief I helped her write. She had been incarcerated since she was 19, 3 decades behind bars. When the letter came, stating the hearing was granted, she didn't cry. She just handed me a bar of soap from her commissary ration. It was lavender scented. She said, "Thank you," without speaking. I kept that bar of soap in my locker for months. Not to use, but to remember. I started dreaming in legal terms. Sometimes I'd wake up with phrases in my head: material error, burden of proof, mitigating factors. They didn't frighten me. They felt like tools, weapons, keys, and I was building an arsenal. One night, long after lights out, I sat on the edge of my bunk, the moonlight falling in stripes across the floor, and pulled out my own case file. I had read it so many times the pages had softened at the edges, but that night something shifted. A paragraph in the transcript, a ruling from the bench, a detail I had overlooked. My hands trembled. I read it again, then a third time. I pulled my journal close and began to write, not about someone else's case, but mine. The prison bench had taught me the law. Now it was time to use it. I had written hundreds of letters before I ever wrote one for myself. Motions, grievances, affidavits, informal appeals, all in someone else's name. I had come to know the language of the law like a second skin, smooth in some places, calloused in others. I knew how to ask without begging, how to demand without sounding aggressive, how to plead while wrapped in citation. I had helped women get medical attention, request sentence recalculations, even win transfers. But when I finally sat down to draft a motion on behalf of Valerie Carter, My hands trembled like it was my first time holding a pen. The truth was, I had avoided my own case for as long as I could. I had read it front to back more times than I could count. I knew every page of the trial transcript, every line from the sentencing report, every misplaced objection, every silence that should have been a scream. But reading it had never been the hard part. Believing I could do something about it, that was the terrifying leap. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I began. The unit was on lockdown for a plumbing issue, and the absence of noise made the air feel hollow. I sat cross-legged on my bunk, my notes and folders stacked around me in piles like paper walls. I wore the same sweatshirt I always wore when I studied, gray, with the name of a college I'd never attended cracked across the chest. I held my pencil tight enough to snap it. I began with the heading, Motion for Post-Conviction Relief, pursuant to Rule 3.850. Those words alone were enough to quicken my pulse. I had written that title before, for others, but this time it felt heavier. It felt like opening a sealed box that had been buried under the floorboards of my life. I took a breath. I reminded myself that I was no longer the woman who had stood silent at her sentencing. I was no longer guessing in the dark. The motion itself unfolded like memory. I laid out the grounds: ineffective assistance of counsel. I cited Strickland versus Washington, the cornerstone case that established the standard. I built the argument step by step. My attorney's failure to call key witnesses, his lack of investigation into the origin of the documents I had been convicted for processing, his refusal to allow me to testify on my own behalf. I gathered affidavits from women who had seen me studying my case, who could attest to the timeline of events, to my character, to the desperation that had led me to accept a plea without understanding its full weight. I worked slowly, each word deliberate. I wanted the judge to feel the story, not just the legal failure, but the human cost. I wasn't asking for pity. I was showing how the system had failed to do what it claimed to value above all: justice. Over the course of 3 weeks, I revised the motion 5 times. I typed the final draft on the unit's ancient typewriter, the keys sticking on the letter E, which made the whole thing look slightly off, like a voice with a stutter. I didn't care. It was mine, my voice, my claim to something better. I included supporting documentation, over 200 pages of exhibits, handwritten notes, case law, and original filings. I placed it all in a thick envelope, addressed it to the circuit court, and walked it down to the legal mail collection slot myself. My hands were sweating. My heart was beating too loud. When I dropped it through the slot, I felt a sudden panic. What if it disappeared? What if it was tossed aside? What if I had missed something and the entire thing would be laughed at behind closed doors? Then it was gone. The wait that followed was worse than sentencing. At least in court, there's a performance, a structure. This was silence, raw and unyielding. Days passed, then weeks, then 2 months. I checked the mail log every morning with a face I tried to keep blank. I told myself not to expect anything, that this was for the act of doing, not the result. Then one morning, just as I was returning from kitchen duty, Officer Ramirez called my name. "Incoming legal mail," he said. I took the envelope with fingers I couldn't trust. It had the seal of the court. I walked straight to my bunk, sat down, and opened it with a paperclip. Inside was a stamped single-page notice. An evidentiary hearing has been scheduled in the matter of Valerie Carter versus State of Florida. You will be notified of the details. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just stared at the words until they burned into my vision. My case hadn't been dismissed. It hadn't been ignored. It had been heard. The door I thought was welded shut had cracked open, even if just an inch. Word spread quickly. "Professor's going to court," someone whispered in the library. "She filed it herself." I nodded politely, but inside I felt a shift, a small seismic movement in the ground beneath me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was proof that paper could be louder than bars, that a woman with no money, no lawyer, no platform could make the walls listen. The hearing was held by video. I sat in a small room with two correctional officers and a screen mounted high on the wall. My new attorney, court appointed for the hearing, barely looked at me. But I had provided everything, every citation, every piece of research, every cross-reference. He carried my voice into that courtroom because I had handed him the words, perfectly bound and indexed. I watched the judge lean forward as my arguments were read. I watched the prosecutor's expression shift slightly when the court realized just how many holes my original defense had left unpatched. I listened as the clerk read back the dates, the deadlines that had been missed, the evidence that had gone unchallenged. And when it ended and the screen went black and the room emptied again, I sat alone, breathing in a silence that felt different this time, not hollow, not indifferent, but expectant, the kind of silence that comes before a verdict, before a door opens, before a voice is finally allowed to echo. My first case wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I had won something no one could take away, the right to be heard. There is a particular echo in prison, one that doesn't come from footsteps or metal doors, but from voices, voices that rise and fall like wind through a canyon, colliding, retreating, returning. Some women yelled to be heard, some whispered until their words decayed into silence. But I discovered something different, the quiet authority of a written voice. It didn't crack, it didn't beg, it didn't get cuffed and led away. And once I learned how to make mine speak, it never stopped. I began with the women around me, the ones whose stories were tangled in bureaucratic thorns, whose sentences had outlived their crimes, whose pleas had fallen on deaf ears. They came to me quietly at first, asking if I could look at something, sliding manila folders into my hands like contraband. I read them all, sometimes by the flickering light above my bunk, sometimes with my knees pressed to cold tile floors in the library, sometimes beneath the long fluorescent tubes of the visitation room, where hours passed like molasses in winter. There was Tanya, who had aged out of foster care straight into prison, whose public defender had confused her file with someone else's. There was Bernice, whose English was patchy and who hadn't understood a word of her plea agreement. And there was Alondra, serving 20 years for being in the wrong car at the wrong time, too scared to speak up, too young to know she could. I became their voice. At first, I copied legal templates word for word, carefully replacing names, case numbers, and dates. But then I began to shape the motions myself, adding layers, refining arguments, anticipating counterpoints. Each page became a polished stone in a mosaic I never saw in full. I mailed them out one by one, these letters to invisible gatekeepers, knowing that most would never write back. But a few did, and when they did, it felt like planting something in dry soil and seeing green rise through the cracks. My cell became a legal clinic without a door. Word spread. Women brought me scraps of paper, wrinkled judgment forms, denial letters, and hope that felt brittle to the touch. I had no office, no law license, no title. only knowledge, and in a place built on silence and submission, that was enough to be dangerous. The officers didn't like it. They called me the lawyer, sometimes with derision, sometimes with thinly veiled threat. I kept my head down. I never argued, but I kept writing, because every motion filed, every rehearing granted, every sentence reduced, chipped away at something larger than my cell door. It chipped away at the idea that prison stripped you of identity, of purpose, of power. One day, a warden's assistant summoned me to the administration building. I was led down unfamiliar hallways, past the chapel, the medical wing, the intake center, until I was brought to a small room with a single table. A woman in a blazer was waiting for me. She introduced herself as a representative from a nonprofit legal advocacy group. She had read a brief I'd written, filed on behalf of a woman who had since won parole. She wanted to know if I would contribute to their newsletter, anonymously, of course. My words would be published, my thoughts printed, my voice carried outside these walls. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice in that moment. It had spent too long surviving, not speaking. That night, I sat on my bunk, staring at the empty page. What could I say that would reach people who had never felt concrete through bare feet, who didn't know the sound of 100 women sleeping in fear? I started simply, "My name is Valerie, and I found freedom before I ever left this place." I wrote about law as a language, about how understanding it was like learning how to breathe underwater, terrifying at first, but life-giving once mastered. I wrote about the women who had trusted me with their stories, and about the pain of seeing some never get answers. I wrote about persistence, not because it made you noble, but because it made you whole. I sent the essay, unsure if it would matter. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a law student in Illinois. She had read my words in the newsletter and wanted to correspond. She had questions. She wanted to know how I had learned, how I had stayed sane, how I had built a sense of purpose in a place designed to erase it. I wrote back, surprised at how easily the words came. Then came another letter, and another, from students, from advocates, from women in other prisons, each one a thread connecting me to the outside, each one a testament to the power of one voice, steady and sure, even when confined. I started writing regularly, not just briefs and motions, but essays, reflections, even guides. I wrote about sentencing disparity, about racial bias, about solitary confinement, about motherhood behind bars. The topics were not abstract, they were scars. I poured them into paragraphs. One afternoon, I was called to the warden's office again. This time, she was waiting with a copy of a national legal publication. My name wasn't on the cover, but my words were. My article had been republished, and someone from the state bar had written a response, respectful, encouraging, offering to send books. I thanked her and left, holding the journal like it was something sacred. It wasn't pride I felt, it was recognition. Not by the system, not yet, but by myself. I had found my voice behind bars, and no one could silence it again. It didn't speak loudly. It didn't shout. It simply told the truth, and people were finally listening. It started with a sentence, not the one etched into my conviction, but the one I wrote on a sheet of yellow paper with a dull pencil, the lead worn down from repetition. I respectfully request reconsideration of my case based on new evidence and legal oversight. It didn't sound like much. No thunder, no rage, just 12 words and a signature, mine. But in those quiet syllables, folded and mailed, sat the seed of something I hadn't dared to name, freedom. By then, I had read thousands of pages of legal text, statutes, appellate decisions, case law, footnotes, dissents. I knew the architecture of injustice, the tiny cracks in foundation where mercy or error or exhaustion might slip in. I had written for others, helped women argue for their children, their health, their dignity. But this time, I was writing for myself. I gathered the pieces like relics. The autopsy report that hadn't been disclosed at trial. The character witness letters my first attorney never submitted. The prosecutorial remark made outside the jury's presence, preserved only because a transcription intern included it by accident. These were pebbles, small and easily overlooked, but I stacked them carefully, one atop another, until they resembled a staircase. Motion by motion, I climbed. My case file had grown into a stack thick enough to weigh down the corner of my bunk. The guards began referring to it as the tower, but I kept adding to it legal briefs, exhibits, research annotations. Every piece documented a flaw in the process that had brought me here. Every line was a quiet rebellion. I didn't shout, I cited. It took months, then more. The waiting hollowed me out some days, filled me with fire on others. I learned to measure time by paper. A new envelope meant hope. Silence meant the system was still deciding whether I was worth revisiting. I paced the yard with paragraphs in my head. I revised clauses in my sleep. And still, I waited. Then, one cold morning, a corrections officer came to my cell door with a manila envelope. I had seen enough rejections to know their texture. This one was heavier. It bore the seal of the appellate court and my name typed cleanly across the front. I opened it with trembling fingers and sat down before reading a single word. The ruling was 10 pages long, dry, procedural, almost clinical. But on page 7, halfway down, it said this: in light of cumulative deficiencies in representation and procedural inconsistencies, we find sufficient grounds to grant a hearing to reconsider sentencing and conviction. I read that line again and again. My breath slowed. My fingers stopped trembling. I wasn't free, not yet. But someone in a courtroom far away had acknowledged the possibility that I had been wronged. That mattered. Weeks later, I was transported to court, the same building where I had once stood like a statue, frozen in fear, drowning beneath legal terms I barely understood. This time, I wore the same uniform, but inside I was different. I wasn't a defendant. I was a petitioner, an advocate, an architect of my own argument. They brought in the judge, older now, with a deeper crease between his eyes. They read the procedural background. Then they asked if I had anything to add. I stood, paper in hand, and for the first time in my life, I read my own words in a courtroom. I laid out my case, not with emotion, but with clarity. I spoke of discrepancies, omissions, of the counsel who hadn't investigated my alibi, of the expert testimony that had never materialized. I quoted statutes, referenced rulings, cited precedent. The silence that followed was thick enough to hold shape. The hearing adjourned. More waiting. Time hung in the air like humidity, heavy and unrelenting. I returned to the prison, to the same bunk, the same whispers, the same shadows stretching across the floor at dusk. But something had shifted. The air inside me had changed. Then one morning, I was summoned to the warden's office. No explanation, no warning. The warden handed me a document, eyes unreadable. The paper bore a stamp, dated that very day. The charges had been vacated, my sentence overturned. No celebration, No trumpet, just ink on paper and a date set for release. When I returned to my unit, the news had already rippled through the cell block. Some women clapped, others nodded quietly, as if in solidarity with a battle we had all fought in different ways. But I felt no victory, only stillness, the kind that follows a storm you've survived alone. On the day I left, I packed my few belongings, 2 paperbacks, a journal, and the binder filled with every motion I had ever written. I walked out wearing borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit into a world that had forgotten my name. But I hadn't. I knew exactly who I was now, a woman who had entered prison in chains and left through the strength of her own mind, not because anyone opened the door for me, but because I found the key, letter by letter, clause by clause, until the lock finally turned. And when it did, I stepped out, not blinking in the sunlight, but seeing clearly for the first time.